Dickon, I'm delighted that you've joined me today to talk about quite a unique sale that we have coming up tomorrow, October the 1st. And it's the collection of Deborah Brown. And we've about 183 lots, but it includes a significant amount of work from her own work, together with paintings and works of art by other artists, many of whom were friends of hers, including Basil Blackshaw, William Scott, T.P. Flanagan, and others. So it's a really interesting sort of selection of work that meant something to her. Obviously those works by the other artists, but also the significant body of work, much of which has never been seen by the public. Now, the auction is an online auction and it takes place tomorrow on adams.ie on our website, and it begins to close at 2 p.m. So what I'd like to do this morning, Dickon, is just to have a chat with you about Deborah Brown and where she fits into the history of Irish art in the sort of the post-war period, and perhaps you might sort of just fill us in a little bit briefly on her position and how you perceive her position. But what I thought, having read through your lovely piece that you and Jane Beattie, your colleague in this particular project, which we've published in the catalogue, there's a lovely sort of story about how she continued to work, without, in many ways, I suppose, without any pressure to have to sell. And that I always see as being somewhat of a double-edged sword, because on the one hand, when you're just doing what you like as an artist, you're just producing things that mean something to you, but they're not tested in the market during your lifetime. And in some ways, that's perhaps why a lot of people have said to me over the course of the last couple of weeks while this catalogue has been out, who's Deborah Brown?
Yes, and it's a very interesting question in a way, because also seeing the exhibition, you might feel there are 3 or 4 Deborah Browns, and her starting point as an artist was really quite traditional, because she came from this a family who had a very cultured family. James Humbert Craig was a friend, her first sort of informal teacher. So the early work is very much post-Craig, and then she goes to NCAD, she goes to Paris, and the work begins to change a lot after what she'd seen in Paris. But what's remarkable is she really came back to Belfast in end of 1950 and immediately became this sort of almost this sort of the epitome of the younger generation. She had her first exhibition with what became the Arts Council in 1951. She had a British Council solo show in Glasgow on the advice of the Scottish colourist J.D. Ferguson, who'd seen her work in Belfast. She started showing with Victor Waddington in 1953, still in her mid-20s. She had a solo show at what became the Ulster Museum in 1956, again, still in her 20s, because John Hewitt was a great fan. So she was, very young and successful at that point. And, the thing with Deborah, that she was the incredibly nice, gentle, kind person, but absolutely steely and determined and ruthless about her work. And in the mid-50s, I think the sort of the sort of expressionist style of painting she'd been making began to frustrate her. She began to find limitations in it, despite what she'd achieved. And partly through work she was doing with set designs for the Lyric Theatre for Mary O'Malley at that time, and beginning to see work coming from New York that she saw in London, people like Jackson Pollock, Rothko, De Style from Europe. She was really very aware of the most recent things happening in painting, and also her own vision of her work that came through working in the theatre. She began to move to a more abstract mode of working, and did this very methodically, that you can see the change. The works you have from 1955, then very different from the 1957 works. And 1958, she started making entirely abstract gestural paintings. Very few of them at that stage. And then they led to these extraordinary ones in 1959, of which you have some great examples in the auction that were, I think the first gestural abstract paintings made in Ireland. And it's not just they were the first, they're really very, very good. They're incredibly confident. She worked at a big scale. They're very tightly organized, but they have this sense of, very individual mark making. And the progress from that time is incredible, because she starts making these in 1959. By 1961, she is cutting through the canvas. She is adding these materials which you wouldn't expect to see in fine art, like nails, cane, papier-mâché, acetate. And this is 6 years before, or 5 years before, Arte Povera movement started showing Italy doing something similar. So, she's gone from work that would fit well into a sort of, New York School exhibition, post-war European painting exhibition in the late 50s, to suddenly within a couple of years making work that is absolutely at the cutting edge of what's happening. And then 3 years later, she starts shaping fiberglass and adding fiberglass onto monochromatic canvases, and then in 1967 making freestanding fiberglass works, a brilliant orange one of which you have in the auction. And this is what I find interesting, going around at the beginning of the viewing with art historians, with people who really know about Irish art and international art. The feeling was, in 1959, she's very much at the forefront of what's happening internationally, ahead of, I think, what's happening in Ireland. She then begins to almost get ahead of a lot of what's happening in Europe. And by the mid-60s, there was no one else, as far as I know, in the world making art quite like this. These extraordinary fiberglass pieces and they're not easy to look at, and they're difficult to make. I mean, they're almost there's a sort of industrial quality to them, and the ambition is incredible. And she was showing in London in 1959, 1964. She was showing with the New Vision Centre Gallery, which is very avant-garde abstract painting gallery. And I think then by the mid-60s, she'd almost got to the point where there wasn't anywhere to show work like this. You had the Casman Gallery, you had Robert Fraser beginning to show American abstract painting, but the idea of these constructions on canvas, no one was showing that.
And also, what strikes me is the not only obviously, as you say, she's unique amongst Irish, North and South, at the time, but that she was pushing the boundaries in that particular aspect of using sort of fiberglass. But when did her interest in the creating the images of the animals, these big three-dimensional pieces, when did that enter her work?
I think she moved to a point where by the mid-70s, she'd begun to feel she'd sort of exhausted, I think, sort of fiberglass, and exhausted the sort of the where she wanted to go with that. And then again, it's just these two sides of Deborah. One, there's this incredibly determined, very clear-minded artist, and also someone who was had a great sort of interest in people. I mean, she's a very lovely, kind person, loved animals. So there is a side to her then, I think, that almost wanted to re-engage with what was around her a bit more. Her work is extremely abstract, non-referential, up to, there's a beautiful series you have in the auction of 1974 watercolours. And by this stage, she was showing with Hendricks Gallery in Dublin, and people like the Shambles Gallery in Northern Ireland. And that she was sort of shown these works that are absolutely beautiful. But then I think she almost sort of had this moment when she re-engaged slightly with the image through seeing a lady on a bench, I think in New York, and the sort of sense of isolation and the sort of sculptural qualities of the early work began to come back in. Incredible work she has in the Hugh Lane Gallery, Waiting, which is the first installation I think that was ever really made in an Irish gallery. And again, she's so groundbreaking, but did this in a very pop art way. You know, you have this installation and it's papier-mâché and wire, and it was quite a long time before she made bronzes, and some of those were actually the animal sculptures. So some of those go back to memories of her childhood, and the sort of this idea of the way animals and humans interact, and that there's two fantastic works, bronzes. You have one of which has two rams' heads in together. It almost has the same shapes you get in the 1959 abstract paintings. And so this development is, in a way, there is a sense that it is a change in the early 80s to sculpture, and a sculpture of human figure and animals. But in many ways, there is still the same abstract sensibility that runs through it.
One of the things that struck me, Dickon, was the work from the sort of the mid 60s, which really do sort of, she tips her hat to the likes, as you mentioned earlier, Rothko, in particular in those large canvases, those tempera on canvas. Did she spend time in New York? Did she travel stateside? Would she have seen much of his work, or how much of that was, coming from her own sort of sense of experimentation with color and form?
Very interesting, because I think her work is very individual. It was driven, it was driven by her personal vision. She saw, in a way, canvases evolving. I mean, when we were working with her, and Jane Beattie, you mentioned, built up a great rapport with Deborah, and Deborah talked to her a lot about the work, and this sense, like with music, that you make a mark on a canvas, and there's almost something that mark in the silence almost then takes on a life and goes somewhere. So it's very personal painting, but I mean, she was very conscious of what's going on in the world. And what is so interesting and a remarkable thing, that in Belfast in the late 50s, early 60s, her great friend Anne Cruikshank, who everyone in Dublin will know well, was at that stage keeper of art, just arrived keeper of art at the Ulster Museum, and over the next few years bought incredible works by people like Helen Frankenthaler, Joan Mitchell, Kenneth Noland, Tapiers, Dubuffet. I mean, it's extraordinary. And I'm sure the conversations she and Deborah, and probably Alice Berger Hammerschlag, would have had, looking at what's happening in the world. And Deborah was extremely modest, and she always said they didn't influence her, but it gives her a context. I mean, I feel you can see in the work the beautiful early mid-50s paintings that you have in the auction, like the Annunciation and the Harper, then the move into slightly more rigid abstraction. And I think seeing these other works, it helped her to free up, possibly. It helped her to do things. But it's very interesting, unique work, and that even the idea of Anne Cruikshank had a brilliant phrase about how Deborah's work almost seemed to excavate the canvas sometimes, even when she wasn't cutting through it. There's a very physical interaction with the canvas.
Yeah. The other, speaking of that, and you mentioned, was it acetate?
Yes.
That she uses, and you think that would have, at the time, been quite a sort of a modern material. And she wouldn't, at that stage, have known whether it would last 10 years or 100 years, because it was such a new material, relatively new material. But to actually sort of incorporate it into an artwork was quite, it was certainly groundbreaking. But what also sort of struck me is that when you look at the really early works that we have in the auction, you can see just how good a painter she was, how painterly her landscapes are. Because I think very often people, they look at abstraction and they go, well, sure, anybody could do that type of thing. But you can see in the range of her work just where she has come from as a very, a very beautiful representational work that she produced early in her career, and then moving sort of through those experimental periods of abstraction, and then ending up with these lovely sort of animal three-dimensional works. Just how brilliant she was at virtually every single stage of her career. And I think that's something that I hope that if nothing else, that this particular catalogue will present people in posterity as a representation, as some sort of small legacy, despite the fact that she's had quite a number of retrospectives in her time. I mean, she had 2 or 3 at very least.
Yes, I mean, three sort of fairly substantial ones. I think the interesting point, we talked this before, was almost this idea that she's been hiding in plain sight, that there's been enough work out there for people to go, right, these are incredible, but there's only one of this period, one of another period. When Jane and I started to work with Deborah, and we were pulling out, 6 canvases from 1963, which hadn't been seen for 60 years. Although you sort of think this is remarkable, and I think the great difference now is that I think people are more ready to look at abstraction. There is more work there to begin to understand her journey and how unique an individual it was, and a body of work that sort of places her, absolutely crucially at the centre of post-war Irish art. I mean, you said that she's such a great technician. Absolutely true. She does extraordinary things as an abstract artist, but obviously comes from somewhere. And she was the first to say how important Craig was to her. And there are lovely Craig paintings in the auction.
Absolutely.
She never sort of left the idea behind that it was, that it was a difficult thing to make art, and her sort of attention to it was incredible. But I mean, it's exciting because you feel we're at the beginning of a rediscovery that I feel like people now, there are Deborah Brown enthusiasts, and that's great, but I think there are new people who have seen the work now, and I think this is the beginning of a rediscovery that we talked about 50 years ago. Bruce Arnold at the Neptune Gallery began to show mainly Gellert paintings and drawings, and really sort of put her absolute centre of our early Irish modernism, quite rightly, and begin to show the work in depth and connect it with what's happening in the world. And once you do that with Deborah Brown, you look at the dates, you look at how she writes about her work. It's very difficult not to see her as this sort of defining figure, and because she doesn't quite fit in, it's taken longer to see that, I think. But I feel, genuinely, I mean, Jane and I have been so excited about this and working with you at Adams with this, because it feels like an important moment, and they're so rare in art.
Yes.
But it feels like an important moment and a rediscovery, and something that in 10 years we'll probably look back and go, can you believe all these were there for sale at the same time?
Yeah, and let's hope that if we've done nothing else this morning, that we might have encouraged a few more people to come in and view, because we're on view up until sort of lunchtime. I think it is tomorrow, up until 1 p.m. So there's still an opportunity for people to come and see this remarkable breadth of her work and the work of her friends and people that she admired. And we will know soon enough to what extent the market will have appreciated her work when the auction happens tomorrow afternoon. So as I say, it begins to close at 2 p.m. Tomorrow on the 1st of October. So we'll keep fingers crossed for Deborah's market, and her reputation can only be improved by this opportunity, which we are so grateful to you and to Jane for having done so much really valuable work on her behalf. And let's hope that it will add to her legacy long into the future. Dickon, thank you so much for joining me this morning, and we look forward to talking to you soon.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.